I was walking through the garden and I never really know what I'm going to find. I saw this plant, I didn't know what it was. And I looked at these big leaves and these long kind of creeping vines. And I looked at the end of the stem and I saw this, what I thought was just the most beautiful vegetable that I had seen. It was this creeping, twirling, sort of a fairy tale looking asparagus or something. And I thought to myself, kind of drawing on my foraging instinct, this looks so delicious. It looks like a vegetable from another dimension. And eventually I found out that it wasn't some crazy plant that I had discovered. It was a squash that had migrated from a garden.
Welcome to the Food Garden Life Show. We think that growing and cooking together builds families and builds communities.
Our goal is to inspire and inform with stories and ideas about gardening, food, and people, and we give gardeners permission and confidence to challenge the rules.
Brought to you by Emma and Stephen Biggs. Thanks for hanging out with us today.
Hey everyone, I'm Emma Biggs and thank you for hanging out with us today on the Food Garden Life Show. I'm a Gen Z gardener, author, speaker, and blogger, and my passion is growing tomatoes, trying new and unusual crops, and saving seeds. I'm also the author of the kids gardening book, Gardening with Emma, and my co-host here on the show is my dad, Stephen.
Hey everyone, I'm Stephen Biggs, food gardening guy, horticulturist, author, and horticultural journalist. The garden can be a lot of work. I know I'm looking out my window right now at the Galinsoga that's growing amongst my celery plants, and I know what I'll be doing later today once this podcast is out. Do you ever wonder what it would be like to have less garden to look after? I sure do, but of course then I quickly ditch the idea because I love gardening so much. But what if I could have less garden and get just as much to eat from it? It's an age-old question. Well, to do that, we can garden more intensively to get more harvest from the same amount of space over the course of a year. We can also use the edible ornamental plants and weeds that are growing nearby. And we've talked with foragers on this show before, but here's another thought. What if we could reimagine the way that we garden by reimagining the way that we cook? What if we used more of the vegetable plants that were already growing? I'm talking about things like squash shoot tips or unripe sunflower heads. When it comes to meat, we sometimes hear the term nose-to-tail cooking used to describe the idea of not wasting any of an animal. Applied to plants, maybe we can think about root-to-flower cooking. Our guest today, Alan Bergo, is passionate about root-to-flower cooking. He's also the author of a wonderful new cookbook, The Forager Chef's Book of Flora: Recipes and Techniques for Edible Plants from Garden, Field, and Forest. Oh, and by the way, Alan also has ideas about how I can use that Galinsoga that's so stressing me out. So stay tuned. You can find him online at foragerchef.com. As always, a thank you to our listeners who connect with us through social media and email. A shout out today to Grant in Orlando, Florida, who saw a post I made on social media about gardens and friendship. And Grant says that he met his wife in a community garden and that after 11 years of marriage, they're still gardening together. I love it. A shout out to Eric, who responded to my post asking how people unwind in their gardens. And Eric says, why, of course, a beer with a friend. Eric, that's definitely a favorite of mine. And a thanks to Donna, who enjoyed the garlic tips that I shared. For garlic lovers, that share was a post by garden guru Doug Oster in Pittsburgh. And if you're into garlic, I really recommend that you head to our past episodes to hear the September 2020 episode where Doug tells us all about how he gets 5 harvests from his garlic. Also, a shout out today to our listeners on Reality Radio 101. If you're catching this podcast before the end of the day on Saturday, June the 26th, you might be interested in the half-off offer on my book, No Guff Vegetable Gardening. Just go to noguffpress.com and you can grab your copy before the end of the day on Saturday, June the 26th. I had loads of fun writing that book with my friend and mentor, horticulturist Donna Balzer. When I left the world of commercial horticulture and started out as a newbie garden writer, I met Donna at a garden writers meeting and we clicked right away. We both loved red wine, we both loved vegetable gardening, and we had both met lots of people who needed guidance in their vegetable gardens. Our answer was our best-selling book, No Guff Vegetable Gardening, and that was 10 years ago. Here's a newspaper review of our book that still makes me smile. And it said, "Occasionally in a librarian's life, a book will arrive that causes immediate bibliomania, a book that is so different, so appealing, and upon reading it so completely perfect that it must be shown with great excitement to everybody who loves books." If you're interested in knowing more, go to noguffpress.com before the end of the day on Saturday, June the 26th.
Do you have show ideas, questions, or feedback?
We want to hear what you think. So tell us. If you drop by foodgardenlife.com, you can email us, or you can find us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, where we hang out under the handle Food Garden Life.
And you can also find me on Instagram as EmmaBiggs_grows, and you can also find me on my website, emmabiggs.ca.
Now, here is our chat with Alan Bergo, author of the new book, The Forager Chef's Book of Flora.
Alan, thank you so much for making time to join us on the podcast today.
Oh, thanks for having me on.
We are super excited to have you on. Your book looks absolutely amazing, Alan. And you were telling us just before we started recording that you sent in 12,000 images. So I just can't wait to dig into more about the book. But before we do that, let's talk about you and just tell our listeners about your background and what brought you to the point of doing this book.
Well, for most of my life, I was a chef and I worked in professional kitchens for a good 15 years. And I ended up running restaurants as the executive chef after kind of a long stint in the restaurant industry. And my last restaurant closed, as restaurants often do. And before the restaurant closed, I'd always thought that I would write a book sometime in my life. And my girlfriend was writing a book, and she said, "Alan, you need to write a proposal. You need to start doing it." So I started writing the book proposal kind of as my last restaurant was closing. And a couple years later, we're just a few weeks away from having it on the shelf.
Congratulations.
I think it's really exciting that it's coming out. And so can you tell us what the inspiration behind writing it was, other than you always wanting to have written a book?
Yeah, well, the inspiration, it kind of changed. At the beginning, I thought, hey, I have like hundreds of recipes that I've used in my restaurants throughout the years. And I could, I'll take the recipes and I'll put them into a book. Easy, right? Absolutely not easy. The more I started to research and learn about the process, and the more I looked at, what I wanted to offer my audience who have been asking for a book for many years now, I decided to kind of split my culinary world, so to speak, into three parts, because I saw that if I included meat and vegetables and mushrooms, which are kind of the three things that I'm most passionate about. Mm-hmm. If I try to fit everything into one book, I'm not going to cover anything as much as I would really like and as much as I think really needed to be covered. So I thought back to the tasting menus that I used to make when I was at Heartland Restaurant, where I spent a number of my formative years working for my former boss and now mentor and close friend, Chef Lenny Russo, kind of the godfather of farm to table cooking in the Midwest here. I thought about the tasting menus, and they were called Flora and Fauna. And I thought, those are great names. I'll add another F to the equation, and we'll have Flora fungi, and fauna. So
Mm.
vegetables, mushrooms, and meat, respectively.
So vegetables, mushrooms, and meat. And you did all the recipe testing, I think, for this cookbook. So tell us about that process. What does that look like, and how do you narrow that down into a book?
The process is it is incredibly dense, and I knew that there needed to be a testing process. I didn't exactly know how I was going to go about it. So what I did is I employed my audience, and I made this is one of the ways Facebook groups are very useful, especially in the wild food world. There's probably 15 different Facebook groups for mushroom hunting and foraging just in Minnesota alone. It's kind of where I am. I'm technically in Wisconsin. So I made a Facebook group, and I started uploading files into it, and then I kind of had people audition to see if I thought they could work out in the group. And we worked at that for a few months, and I got a lot of really good feedback. I'm a professional chef. I've been doing it all my life, but to see if a recipe is successful, it needs to be able to be reproduced not by me, but by other people. And that's
Mm.
really an important part. And teaching a prep cook or someone in a restaurant hands-on to make something that I would make and then serve it to hundreds of people. That's one thing because we're in person, but doing it strictly with words and images is a completely different thing. So that was definitely a process.
Okay.
And before this, you mentioned that you took all the photos or almost all the photos that went into the book, and you submitted so many photos to the publisher. I'm curious to know, is your camera roll almost all plant photos and foraging, mushroom, and cooking photos?
Absolutely. It is a giant archive of thousands and thousands of images. And if you know a photographer, many of them, I have a number of friends that are, videographers, professional photographers. That's actually where I started to teach myself photography was while I was the food stylist for Chef Lenny Russo's cookbook. Mostly it's food, mushrooms, plants, pieces of animals. That is basically the camera roll, but many, many pictures of plants.
Okay. Well, if we focus in now on plants, one of the ideas that really jumped out as I was going through the book is using more of a plant than we're used to eating. And so there's maybe lots of opportunity that we miss in the kitchen. I wonder if you can talk about that for us a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely. So this is where kind of the foraging element, I like to say that being a forager and kind of just being thinking of myself as an intuitive creature who eats and is looking for food, it changed how I think about vegetables. So, I like to think, chefs like to think, oh, we're in a restaurant. We're kind of like, Lord of our own kingdom. I have a list of purveyors. I can order any fruit that's in season, any vegetable, anything, and have it delivered right to my doorstep. So that means that I am in touch with the seasons and the pulse of nature and what's going on. And to an extent, that may be true. At least that's what I thought. Once I started spending more time in nature, actually, after my last restaurant closed, I started supplying another restaurant that I admired with stuff that I would harvest. I started spending a lot more time outside. And when I'm out, looking for plants or mushrooms or an ingredient, I am using my instincts. I'm looking for things that maybe I don't know what this plant is. And it just so happens that one time I was out in a garden. I live on a old family compound in Wisconsin with my girlfriend and her whole family. It's about 400 to 500 acres of wooded land, but there's a lot of gardens. I was walking through the garden, and I never really know what I'm going to find. There's no pesticides or chemicals. Everything has always been organic here, and I never know what I'll find. I saw this plant. I didn't know what it was, and I looked at these big leaves and these long kind of creeping vines, and I looked at the end of the stem, and I saw this, what I thought was just the most beautiful vegetable that I had seen. It was this. creeping, twirling, sort of a fairy tale looking asparagus or something. And I thought to myself, kind of drawing on my foraging instinct, this looks so delicious. It looks like a vegetable from another dimension. And eventually I found out that it wasn't some crazy plant that I had discovered. It was a squash or a gourd that had migrated from a garden. And being a chef, I'd cooked, thousands of pounds of zucchini, all types of heirloom species. I'd never seen one in a garden, and I had no idea what it looked like. So I cut some of the stems to try to figure out what they were. And then I ended up speaking to my girlfriend's stepdad who lived in Nepal when he worked in the Peace Corps. And he told me they eat squash shoots in Nepal. And then I start doing a little bit of more research. A lot of what I do is research. It's not just being outside or cooking things. And I see, oh, they cook them in Mexico. They cook them in China. And then I was speaking with a member of my kitchen staff one day, and he told me about he's from Central America, and they told me about something called sopa de guyas, which apparently they would say that women would stand on a corner with a little bag of ingredients to make a soup. And the soup is essentially a whole squash soup. So you have squash blossoms, squash shoots, squash leaves, and small squash. And you cook it all together with little masa dumplings. And it's the whole squash soup, like the whole part of the plant in a single dish. And I thought that is just beautiful. And the squash is really a perfect example of how foraging and looking for different ingredients changed how I consider vegetables that I thought I knew and could make them completely new.
So the idea of when something is ready to eat is maybe something we go in with a set idea that we have to wait for the squash to be ready. But you're saying that we can think about that plant being ready to eat at different times. We can pick those shoots and eat different parts of it.
Absolutely. And I think another important kind of point to make is I like to think of a squash as it grows, or think of someone who is growing plants, growing a garden, maybe a few hundred years ago, or even earlier, as squash or, one of a plant that we have a very long history with as humans. If you are, say, a subsistence farmer and you're growing plants to feed yourself, maybe there's not a lot of food around, are you going to wait for the squash to be ripe and get this, quote unquote, finished product? Or are you going to be harvesting from this plant continually throughout the growing season because it's producing food that you can eat all the time?
Okay, and I want to go back to the squash shoots for a second because I think that's so cool. And I know I've eaten lots of squash flowers, but I've never eaten the shoots. So could you quickly tell us what is the best way to eat them?
Well, gently and delicately cooked. So you could steam them, you could blanch them for just a minute. You could just throw them into a pan and kind of barely wilt them. Uh, Chef Magnus Nilsson has a great line about cooking vegetables in his book Favakin, where he describes a piece of kale cooked so quickly it is dying on the plate, or so briefly. That's a good way to think about delicate vegetables like that. So they don't need a lot of cooking.
You don't want to spoil that beautiful look of that shoot with the little tendril coming out of it.
Yeah, or overcook them. They cook very quick.
Okay. One of the ideas that jumped out at me in the book was this idea of there being shared flavors between plants in the same family. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, so the essay is I ended up writing a whole keynote speech about it. It's called Acquired Taste: plant families and the flavors they share. And some of my friends and other people have kind of alluded to something like this. I really wanted to figure out a way to put words to what I was experiencing, because I kept kind of running into it again and again. So a good example is Galinsoga. If you know of Galinsoga, a lot of gardeners have Galinsoga as a very aggressive weed here in the United States.
Mm-hmm.
And I was serving little dolmas, little green rolls that were made with Galinsoga at an event one day, just rolled up kind of like grape leaves. And as I fed them to people, one person took a bite and he said, "Did you put artichokes in this?" And I said, "No, it's Galinsoga." I'd never stopped to really consider the flavor. It tasted kind of green, maybe a little spinachy to me. And then I gave it to another person, and another person who was not even within earshot of the first person said, "Oh, it's artichokey." And
Hmm.
that really made me pause for a moment, because earlier in the season, I had been cooking unripe sunflower heads just like an artichoke. And the flavor is eerily similar. Sunflowers have a stronger flavor, but then also sunflower oil, Smootie's oil that's made in Pierce, Minnesota specifically, the way that they make their oil, it keeps the flavor of the sunflower oil, and it's a very strong flavor. It's a very particular flavor, something I kind of I might describe as the aster flavor, because all these plants are in the Asteraceae, and for lack of a better description, they all have kind of a similar artichokey taste to them. So from there, I started thinking, all these plants, dandelions have a little bit of a similar flavor. Other asters, uh, other asters can kind of taste a little bit similar. Sochan is another one, and I'd love to talk about that plant a little bit more too. But the more I thought about it, the more I thought, maybe the flavor of an artichoke is not exactly the flavor of an artichoke. Maybe that's not the best way to describe it. But the artichoke flavor is not exactly artichoke. Rather, it's a set of, some sort of flavorful compounds that are shared in a number of different plants in this botanical family. And I thought about it, and it just kind of blew my mind. And then I found another really good example, and there's more examples than just these two that I'll talk about. But cherries and almonds are in the same family.
Mm-hmm.
And this was this one I had kind of thought about a little bit before. Chef Michel Bras in his book talks about apple seeds having a flavor of almond. And I always kind of remembered that and tucked that away in my hat for some reason. Cherry stones taste of almond. There's a spice made in the Middle East called malab, made from the cherry Prunus malab, and it's used as an almond seasoning.
Interesting.
So same kind of thing here, but a different family. This one it should be mostly plants in the Prunus genus. Plum kernel oil tastes of almond. So this almond flavor, which should be linked also to amygdalin, which in these examples needs to be denatured by cooking or dehydrating or exposure to air. The amygdalin seems to be kind of connected to that almond flavor a little bit, or a lot of it rather. But the same kind of thing with the artichokes. The flavor that we think of as almond, I would say, is not exactly, that's not the best way to describe it. Rather, it's a group of aromatic compounds, flavorful compounds that are shared within plants that are related botanically.
Interesting. And that's got me thinking about a feeling I've had a few times as I eat Saskatoon berries, that I'm sure that I perceive some almond in there. So that's something it's got me thinking about that now too.
So, funny enough, I am doing a talk for a homebrewers group in Canada next week. And I was talking to the guy who's organizing it just yesterday. And he said, Alan, maybe you can help me figure something out. one of our brewers made this beer out of Saskatoon berries, and it tasted so strongly of almond. Like,
Ah,
and I said, well, I can tell you why. It's because it's related to cherries, and it's in the stones. It's in the seeds. So I make a very traditional preserve of Saskatoon berries. It's a Native American fruit leather that doesn't contain any sugar. You just take these service berries, we call them down here, you mash them up and make them into like a little patty or spread out the paste, and you dry it, and
hmm.
it tastes like almonds. So same thing.
Well, this whole concept is really fascinating to me because it has me thinking about how difficult it can be for people in zones like ours, where we're USDA Zone 5B. Artichokes are hard work here, but Galinsoga is not. And so
I don't think it's hard work anywhere.
so what an interesting idea. Now, let's jump back to Sochan because you said you wouldn't mind talking more about that.
Yeah, so Sochan is in the first chapter, and it is really a great grain, a really hardy grain that has a deep tradition in America, in the American South. It is really the premier green of the Cherokee, along with, according to Cherokee author Nancy Clemens, fatback and corn and bean dumplings. But I learned about Sochan from my good friend and mentor, Sam Thayer, who writes the most excellent foraging field guides, I think, in the world. He is the one that introduced me to Sochan. So Sochan is Rudbeckia laciniata, and it's a Rudbeckia, so it's related to black-eyed Susans, which you can also eat. But the green part of the leaves and the stems are a very traditional green in Cherokee culture and very popular in different places in the American South. They also grow really well even up north in Minnesota and Wisconsin. And down south, you might actually see this green still sold in farmers markets. And it's just a delicious green. You can get 3 to 4 harvests from the plant a year. And after the flower stalks die back, you're actually going to get my favorite greens of the whole year, which are kind of much different looking than the leaves that come when the plant is making the flower stalk. It makes basil leaves after the flower stalk has died back. And all of the greens are delicious. It gets a stronger flavor as it ages. Like the young greens are really nice and mild. The older greens can still be made tender by braising, like collard greens, but they'll have a stronger flavor. Um, they're just really, really delicious and just a really good plant that is, I think, really underused in the wild food community in kind of the world I'm in. But it's a great one to have in the garden too.
Now, you arranged the book into 4 different chapters. We have verdant, abundant, aromatic, and nourishing. So, what made you decide to arrange the book this way?
Well, originally when I pitched the proposal, I cook everything, I live my life very seasonally, so it had a seasonal cadence to it. And as I was talking to the publisher, they said, "Well, Alan, not everyone lives in the Midwest, and having it be strictly seasonal like this, maybe we should consider a different organization." So I said, "Okay." And I kind of broke things up, and I didn't give them the names. The credit for that I really have to give to my fantastic editor from Chelsea Green, Michael Mativier. He was the one that kind of helped me organize things a little bit differently. I'd kind of broken it up, but we didn't have names to separate it like that. But really, what it is it's more of an intuitive way of organizing everything that I put into the book. For example, the first chapter, Verdant, is green. It's all about green leafy things. And if you look at a lot of other books in the wild food world, we're talking about most of the time we're going to talk about a bunch of different plants. And for example, we might have, okay, here are 5 pages of recipes for lamb's quarters. After that, there's going to be recipes for nettles. And after that, we're going to have recipes for amaranth. So when I'm cooking with greens, I might cook amaranth and nettles and lamb's quarters all together. And saying, putting a recipe in a book that I say is just for lamb's quarters, with some exception, when I could use it for a number of different greens, it didn't seem like the way that I wanted things to be organized. It kind of seemed like it had been done before, and it's just not. That's not the way I cook. So I wanted to organize things in a way that was a little more intuitive. So the recipes in that chapter and for most of the recipes in the book, they'll just call for leafy greens. I talk a little bit about separating the greens by flavors. So greens that have a strong flavor, those are in one portion. So dandelions and other bitter greens, and then greens that I would describe as, sweet, not like sugary sweet, but sweet kind of meaning mild and tasty. Nettles, lamb's quarters, amaranth, things like that they're all kind of grouped together. So instead of going like down a list saying this species, this plant, this next plant, and saying this recipe is just for this and that, I give a recipe for the first recipe in the book is for one of my favorite things, wild green cakes. And you can use any plant, any leafy green that you want, because that's how I cook.
That's great. Teaching home cooks, gardeners to be a little bit intuitive then about what they're using in a given recipe.
Yeah, exactly. I wanted to have it be more of like a choose your own adventure sort of experience than something that was very prescriptive.
Well, should we pick a couple examples from Verdant that you can, couple top ingredients that you'd like to share with our listeners?
Yeah, so Sochan was a really good one. That we covered that one already. The other one, another really good one is nettles. And most people, when we think of nettles, we will think of Urtica dioica, which is the common nettle that probably came from Europe. But there are other nettles too, and they have different flavors. So one of my favorites that I just ate for lunch a couple hours ago is Lapertea canadensis, or the Canadian nettle, as some people will call it. And it's got a totally different flavor from common nettles. And some people might prefer it. The flavor is a little bit milder than your common nettle. The common nettles also have they have a saline, I don't like to use the word fishy, but especially if you steam them without blanching, because blanching something in water is always going to leach out some sort of flavor a little bit. If you steam them, they will have a much stronger kind of saline oceanic quality to them, where wood nettles or Canadian nettles, they don't. They have a really nice, they have a perfume to them, and they're much more just vegetal, but they're an excellent plant too, and they come up a little bit later, almost summer, but just not quite. And they also have a shoot portion. So I don't really think of nettles as having a shoot, but wood nettles, they have a shoot. You can have them where it's almost like a little vegetable.
I've never given much thought to nettles other than being annoyed when they touch me in the garden. And last year, for the first time, I made a nettle soup. Quite loved it. But as you're talking about the different types of nettle now, I'm wondering what it is I have in my backyard because I haven't a clue.
Yeah, and I mean, one thing I like to tell people is the price that chefs pay for nettles. I mean, 12 to $15 a pound.
Wow.
Wow. I was thinking about the stinging nettle in our backyard, and I was thinking, wow, it'd be great to get rid of that.
There you go, Emma. $12 to $15 a pound.
Yeah. Now, could you share a couple of your favorite crops from the abundance section in the book?
So abundant is kind of the chapter that deals with garden vegetables and things like that, and kind of how my instincts that I nurtured working with wild food, kind of changed my outlook, cooking with the whole plant and things like that. Uh, if you go into a grocery store in St. Paul by where I am, and I look at fennel, most of the time it's going to be a bulb. and it's going to have the top cut off. If you go to a garden and if you grow fennel, we all know that fennel does not just come in a short, stocky bulb. It is a lot more than a bulb. It has giant, leafy green fronds that come out of the long stems, and those are good to eat too. They take a little bit longer to cook, but fennel fronds, they make excellent little cakes. I mix them with a little bit of Parmesan and breadcrumbs, and they're a great vegetable on themselves. And I have to be honest, when I was a chef and I'd order fennel by the case, most of the time I would instruct my prep cooks to either put them in the pig bucket or toss a couple in the stock, which is basically another way of just throwing them away. And if I would have known how good the flavor gets mild and a little bit of that anise flavor still comes through, that kind of sweet licoriciness, it comes through after they're cooked. If I would have known how good they are, I would have never thrown a single one away. And same goes for carrot leaves.
And let's talk about carrot leaves. Do you have an idea for our listeners what to do? Because that's probably new for a lot of people.
It is. And I used to throw those away too. I was like, oh, the carrot greens, oh, they're full of dirt. Have the prep cooks trim them and get rid of them. If we boil them in the stock, they're going to make the stock green. If you take carrot greens, and I will strip them off the stem, because the stem and the leaves have a little bit of a different cooking time. And then I'll simmer them in a little bit of salted water until they're just tender. And then I'll strain them and let them cool. And then I'll separate them, and they retain their shape and their texture. You can eat cooked carrot greens almost as you would a salad. And historically, salad was salad, and the greens were almost always cooked. So it technically kind of is a salad, but it's really delicious. Dress them with a little bit of olive oil and lemon juice. And I also cook parsnip greens the same way.
Okay, well, I'm excited to try that with our carrot greens because I've known that you can eat them, but I've never actually tried anything with them. I've just eaten a few fresh out of the garden, and I was like, not a fan. So I'm excited to give that a try.
Absolutely. No, if you eat them fresh, the flavor is not that great, and the texture is worse.
Yeah.
They just need a little bit of cooking. But you cook them a little bit, and I just love them.
Well, we hear about the idea of nose to tail cooking with animals, and it strikes me that we're talking about the same concept now with our vegetables, maybe root to shoot cooking, and trying to use
Root
as
to
much
flour.
root to flour. Yes, exactly.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I talk about that all the time with people.
When we're looking at chapter 3, you get into what you describe as aromatic. Let's talk about a couple things from chapter 3.
Well, one of my favorite aromatics, I'm actually harvesting very soon for the distillery that I work with that will make it into commercial products. So last year we made about 900 bottles of 3 different flavors. This year I think we'll do 2 versions with about the same volume, but it's Angelica, and it grows wild all around Minnesota and Wisconsin. It likes wet places, likes to be near trout streams and kind of damp areas. And this is one that you probably shouldn't just go out. You need to know how to identify it. Once you see the plant and once you smell it, I don't really think that anyone would say that they're going to mistake it for a plant that's dangerous. The aroma is so strong. It's like it's kind of like the soul of gin. When I smell, because it's used in gin, specifically the root. But when I smell like Bombay Sapphire, I smell a lot of Angelica in that, and it's really it's a very very unique, very ancient herb. My pastry chef at one of my restaurants, she thought the flavor was way too strong, and then she did not like to use it at all, and I would bring it in. I said, "This is a very special plant. It it's expensive. Like money cannot buy this plant. No one sells it. You can't even order it. Like you should be thanking me for giving you the chance to work with it." And oh, she did not like it. Then one day when the rep from the French chocolate purveyor came in and saw a sink full of angelica, he said, "Is that fresh angelica?" And she said,
Mm,
"Yes." And then he just made a cash offer on the spot.
wow.
After that, she she kind of took a shine to it, and it's one of my favorite stories about the plant.
Is there another plant from the aromatic chapter you can share with us?
Yeah, meadowsweet, an
Mm.
aromatic flower that tastes like almonds.
Ah.
So a lot of people like, when elderflower season comes along, people in the wild food community, you're going to see them all over Instagram and social media, people doing all kinds of things with them. And I think elderflower tastes perfectly fine. But once I tasted meadowsweet, which has a similar, they have a similar shape when you look at the flowers, and kind of a similar cast to the intensity of the aroma. And it's very floral, very, very rich. They can be used interchangeably, but meadowsweet is, I think, infinitely better. And there's all kinds of things that you can do with them. And then from there, use with many other flowers. Milkweed flowers are another one. I use them to make drinks, and their floral aroma is so strong it almost tastes like watermelon Jolly Rancher candy, for lack of a better
Huh?
example. It's intensely
Wow.
fruity. But yeah, the meadowsweet, one of my favorite things to do with these and any other flower that I would make sweet things with is, with flowers, it's difficult to cook with them because you can't just put them in a pan. And you know, you can sprinkle some of them on salads, but some of them, maybe they have a texture that's unpleasant or something like that. What you want to capture with a flower, the thing that's so exciting about beautiful handful of flowers or roses or whatever you have, is the aroma. That's what you want. And one really good way to capture that I talk about in the book is using something that is fatty. So dairy, anyone who's ever left a cut onion in the fridge next to some unwrapped butter will be familiar with dairy being kind of an aroma sponge. So if you take some cream and say a quart of cream, heavy cream, with a quarter cup of yogurt or buttermilk, and you mix it together and you add a few handfuls of flowers and leave it on the counter, you let it sit overnight, it's going to thicken up a little bit and it will become creme fraiche, but it will also, that fat and dairy will have absorbed all of the perfume of the flowers. And then you can just strain the flowers out. If you whisk it, it gets really loose, just like warm cream. And you can strain it out and then take your cream and cool it and use it in just about any place where you would use cream. You can even cook some of them. Certain flowers might lose their aroma if the flavor is exposed to heat, but you could just make whipped cream, add a little bit of sugar or whatever, whip it up, and you will have cream. Like right now, lilacs are blooming in Minnesota, and they will make
Oh.
a delicious cream where you can just let them sit in the cream, whip it up, and it will taste intensely of whatever flower that you put in there, that you want to harness the aroma of.
Wow, that sounds so amazing. We're definitely going to have to give that one a try.
And you've got the gears going in my mind, Alan, because for the first time last year, I made a fig leaf panna cotta where we steeped the fig leaves. And I hadn't thought about how dairy products can be a sponge for these flavors. But now I'm thinking about that. That's exciting.
Okay, we have one more section to talk about. Could you give us one or two of your favorite crops from the nourishing section?
Oh, yeah. So one of my favorites is, do you guys have black walnut trees?
Yes.
Yes.
So when I was a kid, I lived on a main dragon town and there was lots of black walnut trees. And when I was mowing the yard, I'd have to mow the yard as one of my chores. I just hated when the black walnuts would be falling. And they're getting in the mower, it's being loud, it's shooting them out like meteors.
Yeah.
And then I'd go down to pick one up, and this was at the point where the husk is getting soft, and I picked one up and I saw, to my disgust, that there were worms crawling all through the husk of the nut. And now I know that they're composting it. They're helping it along. But I thought, this is the most disgusting thing I've ever seen. This is not a nut. I don't, they might call these walnuts, but these are definitely not food. And nothing could be farther from the truth. And now when I see black walnuts, I wait until the worms have started to soften that husk, and I just roll it with my shoe and I pick them up with a glove so they don't stain my hand. And then I wash them off and I dry them. And I love the black walnut that you crack yourself will be the most intensely flavored black walnut you will ever have. You can buy black walnuts commercially. They're in the United States. They're sold. Hammond's Black Walnuts sells them, but the ones that are shelled, that are pre-shelled, they don't taste as strong. They will never taste as strong uh, as a freshly shelled black walnut. The perfume, black walnuts, you either love them or hate them. They can be an acquired taste for some people, but the freshness of all, and this is all nuts. If you press them between your fingers, they're so fresh, you can see oil weep from them. And black walnut oil, they're very rich in oil, is also a commercial crop. But there's more to black walnuts than just the finished product. So again, same theme here. So as I was looking through some old books and texts and things like that, I came across something called black walnut jam. And I've harvested black walnuts in the green stage when they're unripe before the shell has formed. I worked for a chef from Rome, and he owned his own restaurant in Rome for the good 10 years. His name was Angelo. I'm going to send him a copy of the book, and I'm going to surprise him with it. I just can't wait. But he would say that to make Italian black walnut nocino, which is a liqueur flavored with black walnuts that are unripe, you harvest them on a day of a particular saint, per Italian tradition, like so many things.
Yes.
And that is it's in late June, which just happens to be the time when the black walnuts are young and still soft, and you can cut them through with a knife. But the black walnut jam is a Grecian or Armenian, or sometimes from the Caucasus, it might be attributed to them. A lot of times they will call things jams when things are preserved in syrup. You take the black walnuts when they're very young and you peel them. It is not easy, but the result is worth it. You peel them and they end up having like 6 cut facets, and they turn jet black. So they look like these kind of black, like a black jewel or something. And then I let them ferment in a little bit of water and I drain it off. And then you cook them in sugar syrup and pack them into a jar and let them sit for a few months. You open the jar up and you have these whole walnuts that have immature, barely formed. The nuts are very soft. The best texture I can come up with is almost like soft cheese on the inside. So you have the walnut husk is actually still soft, and you eat the entire nut, undeveloped nut, and immature husk as a sweet.
Oh, wow. And so the shell itself then hasn't hardened and formed at this point.
No, it's soft and you can cut through the whole thing with a knife. And there's British pickled walnuts are a very similar thing, but I thought I've made those. I've made them out of black walnuts. I've made them out of butternuts, which are similar. And I thought the texture of them was one of the worst things that I've ever put in my mouth. But the sugar syrup it changes it, and it penetrates into them, and it makes the texture palatable. It's a really fascinating conversation piece that's delicious too.
Well, we have a big black walnut tree in the backyard that torments Emma and kills her tomato plants. So this is giving us ideas, Alan.
Yeah, no, they are a lot of fun. And another thing you can make is when the walnuts are at the same stage, you can pack them in water. A fascinating property that black walnuts have is that if you put them in water, if you just cover green black walnuts with water, they will ferment more vigorously with no added anything to the water, just black walnuts and water. They will ferment super vigorously, and you don't have to add anything. And then I drain the water off, and then I cook them with spices and vinegar, and you puree them into a condiment. It's called walnut ketchup,
Oh, wow.
and it ends up tasting a little bit like steak sauce.
Ah, that's so interesting.
Excellent. Well, I'm excited about that because we get lots of black walnuts. So, is there a favorite foraged ingredient that you can share with our listeners? And that could be from any of the chapters. What jumps out at you as your favorite?
Well, I have trouble answering questions like that. So I'll tell you that my favorite foraged ingredient is the thing that I am picking right now.
Hmm.
So, and this wasn't even in the book, but it is a good example. This week, I don't have to work in a kitchen anymore. I hunt plants and mushrooms as my job. So I get to try to teach myself skills that I think are really interesting. This week, I was trying to perfect my method of how I harvest the pollen of pine trees.
Hmm.
So you have a window of maybe 2 days if you're lucky. If you get a windstorm, it's completely gone. And you have to go to a place where the trees have a natural windbreak or something like that. The flavor of pollen has a flavor, and it's almost cheesy. It's subtle, it's mild. If you taste a little pinch of it, it won't taste like anything. But if you mix it in some things, in China, there's a traditional sweet, and also in Iran, they make the same thing it's a sort of a raw candy where they take pollen. This is typically from cattail, but cattail marshes have a lot of bugs when their pollen comes out. So I prefer the pine trees because there's a nice breeze and I'm out in the open. In Iran, they might mix the pollen with date syrup, which is a traditional Middle Eastern sweetener. In China, they might use honey, and they just mix the pollen with the sweetener, and it gradually comes together, and that is it. And you eat it. And the pollen, when it's concentrated like that by a little bit of moisture, the aroma comes out and it kind of blooms. And it is one of the most fascinating things I have ever tasted. And it's a good example of why I just love wild ingredients and things that people don't really eat too much anymore, because you cannot buy that in a store.
So then, for a favorite ingredient, something unusual, something that is in season now that you can go forage.
Milkweed shoots, those are in the book, and they are coming up right now, and they are just delicious.
As we start to wrap up, I'm hoping that our listeners are inspired to try cooking some new things, and I wonder if you could share some tips for people who aren't used to being creative with cooking new ingredients. What would you tell people?
To keep it simple, one of the things I used to tell my line cooks was, before you put one more thing on that plate, take something off. So just to eat a new leafy green, broccoli, we see broccoli in a store, and broccoli is a lot more than just a cluster of unopened flowers, which is kind of what we're shown if we go to the supermarket. But if you see broccoli in a garden, the first thing I looked at was, look at these delicious leaves. And In Italy, there's spigriello, which is just as fun to eat as it is to pronounce, which is a type of broccoli grown specifically for its giant leaves. So that my advice would be to try to eat something new, eat some interesting plants, try a new leafy green, and one of my favorite things to do is to steam greens. Uh, Steaming, like I said before, if you blanch things, it will leach out some of the flavor. Steaming greens keeps more of their natural flavor inside of the green. And then I put the green on the plate. I pass a little soft salted butter at the table, maybe a little bit of lemon juice. And that is one of the finest ways that you can enjoy a fresh green, a wild green, any leafy green plant that you have.
Nice. Well, Alan, you're making me really hungry listening to you talk about all these delicious dishes that you're making. And we're almost out of time, so before we finish up, can you please let our listeners know how they can find out more about you and, of course, your awesome new book?
Oh, yeah, thanks. So, my website, where most people know me from, is foragerchef.com. And it's a big collection of all kinds of things. The largest compendium of wild mushroom, specifically wild mushroom cookery on the web. And a lot of other people follow me on Instagram, where I'm at Forager Chef. And the book, there's links to the book on the website and in my Instagram profile. It's on Amazon and all the other places, or I have many options that are not Amazon, which I think is very important too. So there you go.
Alan, thank you for hanging out with us on the podcast today and telling us all about the Forager Chef's Book of Flora. You've really got my brain going with ideas of different things to try. I'm really excited about your book. So thanks again.
Yeah, no, thanks for having me.
Yeah, thanks, Alan.
That was our chat with Alan Bergo, author of the new book, The Forager Chef's Book of Flora. You can find Alan online at foragerchef.com. What did you think? Alan said, "The squash is a perfect example of how foraging and looking for different ingredients changed how I consider vegetables that I thought I knew." Of course, our culinary habits mold what we know and what we harvest, so coming at it with a different lens, like Alan does with his foraging lens, can be refreshing. It reminds me of my friend Adita, who, when visiting my garden one day, asked if she could have some of the leaves from my pepper plants. And when she saw the surprise on my face, she explained to me that she loves cooking with them and that they're a popular ingredient in the Philippines. But they're hard to get here. Speaking of different ingredients, you can see a picture of pine pollen fudge if you go to Alan's Instagram, and his handle is Forager Chef. I was also interested to learn about flavors that are common within plant families. Artichoke is a lot of work to grow here. If I can use that Galinsoga that's stressing me out to give me that artichoke flavor, I love it. As we wrap up today's episode, I'm thinking about my mom's beet borscht. I always looked forward to it, always gave it a generous dollop of sour cream and a hefty sprinkle of salt. And hidden within it, sliced broccoli stems, cut crosswise to give little medallions of broccoli stem. Mom could never bear to waste those stems that are so often discarded, and into the borscht they went. When I make borscht, and I make a pretty decent borscht, I include those broccoli stems too. If this episode piqued your interest in foraging, check out these episodes. Neighborhood Foraging for the Wild Food Gourmet with Robin Henderson in May 2020. And Robin Henderson is the author of The Neighborhood Forager, and it's the book that gave my wife Shelley the idea of using the hot car method to dry some elderberries. You might also like the episode called Foraging as an Outdoor Classroom with Mike Craybill from March 2021. And Mike talks about the grade 7 elective course that he used to run on foraging. Those were lucky students. The Food Garden Life Show is a labor of love for Emma and me. Our goal is to inspire and inform with stories and ideas about gardening, food, and people. We give gardeners permission and confidence to challenge the rules. We can all make a difference in the world. What we eat and what we grow is one way that we can make a difference. If you're a fan, please click follow or subscribe wherever you get your podcast, because it really makes a difference in how we are ranked. The podcast is back next Thursday, and I'm really stoked about this one. Well, actually, I'm stoked about all of the neat people we talk to, but next week we get to talk about something we haven't covered before, which is coppicing, a way that you can grow your own poles and stakes. We also talk about hedgerows, and here's a new word for many of you, the term pleachers. Do you know what that one means? And if you don't, go look it up before next week. We will delve into ways that we as gardeners can, on the one hand, garden, which is really controlling nature, but on the other hand, garden in a way that's environmentally sensitive. Matt Rees-Warren, who is the author of The Ecological Gardener, joins us for a fascinating discussion. You're listening to the Food Garden Life Show. I'm Stephen Biggs.
And I'm Emma Biggs. Thanks for tuning in.